Hello everyone, welcome to History and Culture. During the feudal dynasties, the emperor stood at the pinnacle of power. And the palace was filled with numerous palace maids and eunuchs serving the royal family. However, as the tides of history surged forward and the Qing government was overthrown, the last emperor, Puyi, abdicated. Those palace maids who were once part of the royal court found themselves in an awkward situation, with no one daring to marry them after they were dismissed. What truth lies behind this predicament? According to historians, the fate of palace maids in China's long feudal history fluctuated with the rise and fall of dynasties. Every feudal emperor's harem housed numerous palace maids. These palace maids lived deep within the palace, mainly responsible for attending to the daily needs of the emperor and the harem. Their duties included managing appearances, dressing, and preparing meals. Despite their relatively high status within the palace, their lives were incredibly difficult. They had to adhere to strict rules, and any careless action could lead to severe punishment. A Chinese poem vividly describes the lives of palace maids. 3,000 palace maids with faces painted, how many springs pass without tear stains? In terms of emotional life, palace maids were often lonely and isolated. They were deprived of contact with the outside world and could not reunite with their families and friends. Many of them spent decades in the palace, eventually growing old within its walls. It is worth mentioning that palace maids' fates varied across different dynasties. During the Han Dynasty, most palace maids were selected from ordinary households. Unlike previous eras where many were war captives or slaves of low status, the position of Han Dynasty palace maids was relatively higher, and their futures were not as bleak. Typically, they had the chance to leave the palace and marry around the age of 25. Some lucky palace maids, favored by the emperor, could even rise in status and become imperial concubines, with the potential to attain the rank of empress if they won the emperor's affection. During the Sui and Tang dynasties, however, the fate of palace maids shifted. They became lifelong servants, with no possibility of leaving the palace once they entered. They could only grow old within the palace, from youthful maidens to gray-haired elderly women. During the reign of Emperor Xuanzong of Tang, the office of Flower and Bird Envoy was established, tasked with selecting beautiful women from officials' and commoners' families for the harem. Those who refused were executed. In the Ming dynasty, the selection of palace maids became even more stringent. For example, in the first year of Emperor Tianqi's reign, before his marriage, girls between the ages of 13 and 16 were selected to enter the palace. Soon, 5,000 girls were offered from different regions. In the initial round, 1,000 were eliminated by eunuchs. The next day, their facial features were scrutinized, and any dissatisfaction with their eyes, ears, mouth, or nose resulted in elimination. Those who stuttered when reciting personal information were also dismissed, bringing the total to 2,000 eliminations in one day. On the third day, the eunuchs measured the wrists, toes, and other body parts of the remaining candidates, and those who didn't meet the standards were eliminated. In the end, out of 5,000 girls, only 1,000 were selected to become palace maids. Their fates were grim, as the Ming dynasty practiced burial rites where palace maids were chosen to be buried with the emperor upon his death, a cruel fate they could not escape. In contrast, the treatment of palace maids in the Qing dynasty was much better. At that time, the Qing dynasty rulers divided the populace into classes based on ethnicity and origin. Among palace maids, some were from noble eight-banner families. As a result, the rulers were relatively kind to them, and when palace maids turned 25, their masters would reward them with money and allow them to leave the palace and marry. In the early Qing dynasty, commoners were willing to marry women who had served as palace maids. However, as the 20th century began, the Qing government attempted to save itself through the new policies, but all efforts proved futile in the face of historical forces. In 1911, the Xinhai Revolution broke out. That summer, provinces such as Hunan, Hubei, Guangdong, and Sichuan saw the eruption of the railway protection movement, with Sichuan being especially intense. On September 25, Rong County declared independence, becoming the first region in China to break away from the Qing dynasty, marking the peak of the movement. On the night of October 10, revolutionary soldiers of the 8th Engineering Battalion, led by Xiong Bingquan, fired the first shot of the Wuchang Uprising. Revolutionary forces in Hanyang and Hankow captured these areas on the nights of October 11 and 12, respectively. After gaining control of the three towns of Wuhan, the Hubei military government was established, and Li Yuanhong was elected governor, proclaiming the Republic of China. Within just 2 months after the success of the Wuchang Uprising, 15 provinces, including Hunan and Guangdong, declared independence from the Qing government. On February 12, 1912, the last emperor, Puyi, who was only 6 years old, was forced to abdicate. Consequently, the palace maids, who had lived in the Forbidden City for years, faced dramatic changes in their lives. Although Puyi continued to live in the palace after his abdication, he had lost his legitimate imperial status. He could no longer collect taxes from the people. And with the state treasury empty, the palace could no longer afford the living expenses of the many palace maids and eunuchs. Thus, after discussions between Puyi and his regents and chief eunuch, it was decided to dismiss some palace maids and eunuchs. Initially, the palace maids might have looked forward to life outside the palace. But once they left, harsh realities soon plunged them into loneliness and despair. Despite their beauty and some money, no one was willing to marry these former palace maids. If their parents or brothers were kind, the palace maids could live with their families. However, those without relatives faced a life of solitude. Why did this happen? Many years later, Puyi revealed the truth. Why did no one dare marry the dismissed palace maids? In the feudal society of that time, commoners married primarily to have children and continue the family line. As such, fertility was the most important criterion when selecting a wife. Having served in the palace since childhood, palace maids were constantly under the threat of death for even the slightest mistake. The long-term tension and high stress caused many of them to develop a condition known as blood stasis. The most severe consequence of this condition was that it made it difficult for these women to conceive. As a result, many commoners were unwilling to marry a palace maid who could not bear children for the family and who lacked any social background. Furthermore, commoners highly valued a woman's purity at the time. In their eyes, all palace maids belonged to the emperor, and if the emperor desired, he could favor any palace maid at will. Thus, commoners were unwilling to marry a woman they considered impure. The lives of these dismissed palace maids were marked by tragedy. Some historians have remarked that these palace maids were sent to the palace at a young age and spent their days living in fear. After leaving the palace, the better life they had hoped for never materialized. Instead, they faced the bleak reality of growing old in solitude. Like ants, they were unable to control their own fates. As the old era came to an end, they failed to seize the opportunities of the new era and could not adapt to the changes. Ultimately, they were left struggling in the tragic circumstances of their lives. The collapse of the feudal dynasty took away the glory they once had and left them lost in the new era. This chapter of history shows us the profound impact of historical shifts on individual lives and reminds us to cherish the freedom and equality we enjoy today. This is the History and Culture channel. Liking and subscribing are the greatest help and support to us. Thank you everyone and see you in the next time.